Hello all. Today I'll be presenting my Unit 4 Tableau time series assignment on coercive control within the context of social and domestic violence using the Coercive Control Monitoring Quarterly Report from the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. The data metricized in this statistic is not only closely aligned with crime statistics relating to social violence, but is also closely aligned with Robert Lifton and Edgar Schien's sociological models on cult brainwashing and identity erosion, and that the types of coercion quantified within the dataset represent similar patterns within the methods and timelines utilized to force the psychological disruption and ultimately the complete psychosocial identity breakdowns defined within the Lifton-Edgar model phases and those targeted by groups who exercise the fundamental methods within these dynamics. For our first scene, we have Edgar Schien's three-phase model, which serves to identify the phases of psychosocial disruption within the psychological state of victims being groomed for exploitation through coercive control. Phase 1 of the model suggests that the target's worldviews are methodically dismantled through a series of milieu distortions, fostering disorientation, identity disruption, and ultimately forced helplessness and codependency on either a cult of one dynamic, which is an individual, or within cult-like group dynamics. Phase 2 represents victim identity splitting, as the victim's perception and worldviews begin to become dissonant distortions resulting from chronic indoctrination being reinforced, usually through persistent neuro-linguistic programming strategies, along with exposure and attunement to word redefinition in order to foster compliance through communicative violence. Phase 3 entails the final phase of grooming, constituting total doctrine submission, characterized by victim and group identity merging, where the victim begins to see themselves through the eyes of their groomer's chimera, self-policing themselves where they think and respond to their psychosocial stimuli in regard to the doctrines of the groomer or group as their worldview becomes more and more enmeshed, resulting from the quantum entanglement of incessant exposure to thematic depictions of group ideologies stemming from the chronic attrition or wearing down of their own individual identities. The relation here within the quarterly crime statistic belie in the types of coercive crimes that have been committed, which reflect the methods utilized in obtaining the psychological states just described by using both the statistical pathways and quarterly time spans as the baseline of psychological state transitions within Edgar and Lifton's models. Our next scene within the time series details the identifiable types of coercive controlling behaviors which encourage Schien's previously entailed trivium of psychological states from the crime statistic, consisting of assaulting the victim's self-identifying attributes through a barrage of coercion and force, threats and intimidation, shaming, degrading and humiliation, along with financial abuse tactics, which serve as a significant factor in how well victims can safely protect themselves and leave harmful social dynamics. All psychosocial abuse dynamics consist of the imbalance of power and control within the relationship, with these socializations with abusers closely relicking godlike grandiosity to stimulate victim behavioral changes by operating on the differentiation of distinguished levels of ethics, intensity, and psychological trauma between themselves and their targets to achieve the total destruction of their victim's individual autonomy. The trauma sustained within these dynamics serves to challenge and destroy the fundamental human assumptions within the victims that the world is generally safe and predictable, which acts to slowly erode and distort the victim's worldview of themselves relative to the world around them and the social dynamics within the world altogether. As such, we can see here within this graph that coercive control is the most prevalent method of achieving these aims, with the atomic fulcrum of the control entailing threats, coercion, shaming, degrading, and humiliation, reinforced by solutionary forced economic dearth and other forms of financial abuse. Which brings us to our next scene in the time series, as these behaviors wear down a victim's resolve and significantly contribute to cumulative attrition, or the death by one's identity by 1,000 psychosocial reframing cuts or self-identity assaults. And looking closely at the line graph of the statistic here, we can gauge that as time progresses, so does the level of wearing down of the victim's sense of self, as it is affirmed within both the Schien and Lifton models for thought reform and effort of rebuilding in a target a new compliant identity tailored to serve the groomer or group. And finally, for our final scene within the time series story, we have the complete reframing of the victim's identity and behaviors, with those encouraged by the groomer or group, characterized by psychological disruption, forced helplessness and codependency, psyche disassociation and splitting, trauma bonding, and the merging of the victim's individual identity to harmful psychosocial ideologies. Likewise, as noted within the text box under the graph, its qualitative implications suggest that as harassment, monitoring, and tracking behaviors increase, the victim's autonomy and personal liberties are being decreased, evidenced in the Quarter 5 forecast, further asserting this trend through forecasting its data set. And that concludes my time series presentation on coercive control within the context of Robert Lifton and Edgar Schien's coercion and behavior modification models, which superbly frame the psychosocial phenomena of identity erosion within social and domestic violence. It's been a pleasure presenting to you all, and I look forward to the coming unit tasks. Thank you for listening.